Well, good afternoon, guys. My name is Brent Bice, and today I'm going to be talking about personalization, specifically with Drupal, and creating better user experiences. And so I'm going to preface this by, if you guys are expecting me to get really deep into the weeds and configure something and demo personalization, it's not quite that simple. I don't have any sites to get that kind of traffic that would really allow me to do that, and so I have some static page examples. And we'll be talking about personalization really kind of, I think, at a high level concepts, and then start diving a little bit into Drupal modules that will allow you to start kind of a personalization campaign. A little bit about me. I worked at level 10 for a little over 12 years, and now I work for a company called FFW, if you guys aren't familiar. We are a shop that's based out of the Northeast. We're a global organization. We have 19 offices in 11 countries. We have 250 Drupal developers, 60 Acquia certified developers, and are the largest Drupal shop in the world. And being at the company now, I have an opportunity to work with some pretty decent sized organizations. We mostly focus on global accounts and enterprise organizations, doing a lot of work with Harvard, Stanford, Maersk, do a tremendous amount of work with GE. And more times than not, nowadays, the groups that I'm working with are asking these questions. What is personalization? Why does it matter? How do we begin? And how can Drupal help? And so I thought I would take this presentation to kind of explain this to you guys and give you a good overview and kind of a starting point in case your organization is starting to look at personalizing user experiences. And so what is personalization? Well, you can look on the web, and most people focus on personalization being basically the practice of dynamically tailoring your website. But to me, it's a lot more than just your website. Pretty much all of your digital channels can be personalized to the wants and needs of each of your users. And so the concepts that I'm going to be talking about today extend beyond just your website, but they can, beyond and into, obviously, your mobile applications, into your email campaigns, and far beyond that. So the basic concept is this for you who aren't as familiar. And so the idea is that you have two different types of users, user A, user B. Perhaps one user is located in the United States, another is in Europe. Perhaps their interests are different on the website, and maybe they're using different devices. And you basically, as quickly as you can, gather information on these users, and then you can serve different types of information to those users that are personalized or customized to their individual wants and needs. And the idea is that if you serve information this way, you're reducing the amount of clutter and bullshit that you generally get from a website, and you're focusing very much on what value you can add to that particular customer, and they reward you by conversion and through loyalty and by returns. And so this concept is not a new concept. In late 90s, early 2000s, people were personalizing websites. For any of you who remember like myyahoo.com, you could personalize news sites back in the day. The difference is that type of personalization required you to be an authenticated user, someone who's logged in, and they're asking you very specific questions so that you're having to kind of go through and personalize that information yourself. Whereas today, with the different types of systems integrations, personalization is becoming more automated. And so when you set up and configure these systems, you're getting real-time personalization, and it's much quicker, much more efficient. There are a lot of different types of websites on the web that are personalizing content every day for our needs. A good example is Netflix in the entertainment business. When you first log into Netflix, it'll ask you your user profile. My kids kind of have their own user profile. I have an adult user profile. And as I start to watch Netflix, it starts to gather information and a little bit of data on the types of movies that I like. And based on those types of movies, it starts making recommendations. And so for me, I don't do a lot of movie searches. I don't have time to go through and search through Netflix all the time, nor do I want to. And so usually I'll go up to my browse button and I'll look for the recommendations. And oftentimes, as you can see, because I watch The Gunman, it pulls in various movies that are similar to that, but not only similar to that, but also similar to other movies that I've seen that they think that I might like. And so it just gives me recommendations. It cuts through the clutter and allows me to get to the content that I want faster. Other examples, of course, are Amazon. I think Amazon does a fantastic job of personalization. For those of you, do you guys have Fire Sticks or do you use Amazon Prime to watch television? We'll notice that when you're using Amazon Prime to watch TV, if you have a Fire Stick, they're collecting data on you through that Fire Stick. They're sending that off to their big data warehouse. So the next time you come in and start shopping for products, for example, if my son is watching something on Star Wars or some television show, then I know at Christmas time when I log into my Amazon account, most likely it's going to be recommending toys that could be based off of a television show or movies that he's watching right then and there because they think that that's his interest. And so they're doing a very savvy job of personalizing recommendations above and beyond just slapping my name up because I'm logged in. Product personalization. E-commerce, you're starting to see more that currency can be personalized. And so, as I mentioned before, you have me, I'm shopping in the United States. I want to see things in dollars. Perhaps if I'm in Europe, then when they would show me the currency in euros. And so I don't have to do that translation automatically, which saves me a lot of time and having to think about things. Other personalization that we're seeing is obviously in social media, social sites. Here's an example on LinkedIn. When I log into my LinkedIn account, it's giving me my connections at the top of the page, changes that they've had on their website. It could give me different types of advertising based on things that I've seen. Obviously, advertising is doing a lot more direct, personalized content, as well as my news feeds. Facebook, all of these guys are personalizing data. And obviously, the question kind of becomes, well, why does this matter? Well, at the end of the day, I think that, as marketers, we want our message to be heard, obviously, by as many people as we can. And so we broadcast a lot of content to consumers, right? But as consumers, think about it. You don't want someone cold calling you. I'm in marketing and I want to cold call you. I'm in sales and I want to cold call you, but I hate it when people cold call me. And so the idea is that there's just way too much noise in the world today, and our focus is limited. And on top of that, we want to feel like we're respected. And when you receive content or when you receive a phone call from someone who doesn't know your name, or perhaps when you go to a restaurant and you're not treated right, you don't have a good user experience. You don't have a good experience. And when you don't have those good experiences, you're not going to be loyal to that brand. You're not going to talk nicely about that restaurant that perhaps was rude or whatever. And so it kind of comes back to the human condition. And to kind of even tie that in a little bit more deeply, how many of you have been in an audience or kind of a large crowd and someone yells your name and 5 people turn around because maybe they're all Johns, right? And so your name is one of the most important words that you can actually hear. In sales, there's a lot of psychology behind sales, and they say, for example, if you're on a call, you should say the person's first name or say their name 3 times. And so that is just a way of personalizing an experience for a user and making them become more aware, making them pay more attention to what you're going to say next. Little data to back this up. Jan Rain did some research. 74% of online consumers get frustrated with websites when content appears that has nothing to do with their interest. The CMO Council has done research on this as well, and they say that 90% of consumers find custom content useful, and 78% believe that organizations that provide that custom content are very interested in building good relationships with them. So what can personalization improve for your organization? Well, obviously it depends on what your organization does, right? But think, for example, higher education. You could look at personalizing content because you have various types of users, especially in higher education. I understand working in that space now that not everyone in higher education has the budgets that maybe some larger organizations have. But you have your prospective students, you have your current students, you have graduate students, you have the parents of the students. You have a large number of different audience members, and if you can personalize content on your university's website to the specific needs of those users, then you're going to have a much better chance of converting that user in some way. Obviously, if you're corporate B2B, generating more leads, e-commerce, selling more products. And so the idea of personalization is obviously towards helping your organization meet your goals in some way. And to do that, you have to make sure that you're building sites that make it simple for your users to complete some sort of goal or to fulfill their need. Companies that use data to deliver personalized user experiences have 49% higher revenue growth and 30% higher return on investment than those that don't. And so I can show you stats all day, and I can talk about personalization all day, and I could just dive right in here and start showing you Drupal modules. But I think that there are a lot of companies that slap up a personalization engine. I was talking to a buddy of mine over at AT&T the other day, asking them what they were doing around personalization. And they said that they tried to implement personalization, and it was a complete failure. And of course, he's talking about kind of the hardware and the solution, the software that they're using to personalize this information. And as I'm listening, though, I'm thinking, well, yeah, but what kind of strategy work did you guys do up front to ensure that you're setting everything up correctly? And I kind of planted that seed in his mind, and comes to find out that there wasn't a lot of work done up front. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges or mistakes that businesses make, is that they don't do the strategy work up front. They feel that they can just flip the switch and personalization just magically starts to work perfectly, and that's not the case. And so if you guys are Alice in Wonderland fans, I tend to watch a lot of that now. I have a 3-year-old daughter, and it kind of reminds me of the butterfly on Alice in Wonderland. You need to know who the user is. And if you remember Alice, she kept asking these questions. He's like, but who are you, right? And so that's what we're all wanting to find out from our consumer when they first hit the site. Whether they're an authenticated user or an unauthenticated user, we know little about them. We need to know who that user is so that we can start personalizing content to their needs. Understanding where the user's located, obviously what their interests are, how they're consuming all the information. We have to gather a lot of data to be able to personalize these user experiences. So the first step in this process, in my opinion, really isn't unlike building any type of content strategy for an organization. And for those of you who are doing a lot of content marketing right now, maybe you are familiar with creating these strategies. If not, I'm going to walk you through the process, because this really becomes the foundation for any good personalization strategy. And so understanding who your audience is, that starts off by collecting persona data, demographics and psychographics about your users. It could be things like their age, their gender, their education, their income levels, perhaps their position or title. For example, if you're trying to write content for, I'll give you an example of FFW, for example, where we do a lot of business to business, as you can imagine, because we're a web company. And when I'm writing copy or writing content for a marketing message, or when I'm talking to someone with my sales hat on, what I say to a CIO of a company is completely different to what I say to a CMO of a company. And in between those, what I say to a director of IT is most likely going to be a completely different conversation to the CIO. What I say to maybe a director of marketing might be a completely different conversation that I'm going to have with the CMO, because they have very different interests as individuals. And so understanding who the user is, and then breaking all of those users out into segments that make sense. And there are a lot of different ways of doing that. I think one great way of doing that, for any of you guys here who use an agile methodology, it's kind of in a way very similar to creating user stories. When you create a user story, you identify who your users are, and it's a similar concept. You then segment those users into like groups, and then you create kind of a listing of the needs for those particular users. It's the same thing with creating kind of a content marketing strategy. Once you understand and have those segments in order, what are their goals of each one of those segments? And could start with understanding what their objectives are. What are the pain points that you're trying to solve for that specific user? What are their needs? And what does their buyer journey look like? Where have they, can you figure out where have they been and kind of what do they have to go through in order to purchase your products or services? And even beyond that, once they've purchased your product and services, what does it look like basically through the end of life of that particular customer? How do they engage with your organization? Are they engaging more through email campaigns? What types of campaigns are you getting most of your users from? Are they coming from mobile devices? Are they on desktop devices? Do they need some sort of assistance, assisted devices? All of these things are very important when creating websites in general, but also personalization campaigns. And then not only what value do you provide to that user, but of your user segments and of all of your users, who are those users that provide the most value to your organization? One thing that I've learned in sales is that I can call all day long, and I can court and I can date you all day long, but if you're not interested, I just need to stop and set back because it's not doing you a service and it's not doing me a service. So understanding the value of each one of your consumers or your customers is very important. We're understanding where to kind of spend your time. So once you understand who your audience is, and I threw this slide in, so I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but this is kind of an example for those of you who are creating, user personas. Or if you haven't seen something like this, you can slap one together in PowerPoint very quickly. But generally all it is you might provide a photo of who the user is, gather demographic information on the user. Oftentimes you're writing a bio, and this could be a summary. It doesn't have to be a specific individual, but oftentimes if you're doing any qualitative or quantitative surveys, you can do even cheap SurveyMonkey surveys sending out. You can gather a lot of this information from your users. What are their goals? What are their frustrations? What are their motivations? And then what are their channel preferences? When you start to collect this type of data, it gives the team in general a much better understanding of your audience. And so I'd highly recommend creating user personas and segments. Once you have all of that information in place, start evaluating what your content strategy is going to be. By that I mean, what type of content are you releasing to your users? Is the content infographics or ebooks or blog posts or press releases or white papers? What type of information do you have? And that's going to give you an understanding of the type of information also that you can personalize to users. Understand the channels that your users are using and that you want to be marketing to, right? So website, are you using YouTube or using all these various channels to market? And then of course frequency, how often are you releasing your content plays an important role, as well as reusing content. And to me, when you're creating a content strategy, which really is the underlying essence of data, because users are looking for content. If those of you familiar with inbound marketing, it's all the hot buzz, and so is personalization. The two really kind of feed off of each other. And of course, you need a marketing mix. I don't believe that inbound marketing is the end-all, be-all, savior of everything. I think that you need a very good mix between an outbound campaign and an inbound campaign. But oftentimes, one of the biggest challenges that I see with generating content is people don't look enough at reuse. And by that, I mean, for example, we're filming this video today. I appreciate you, Kyle, for doing that. But, I have a presentation now. I have a YouTube video that I can release. I could take the audio file from this video and turn that into a podcast or some sort of lesson that people could download on iTunes. I can then take that audio and I could write probably 15 or 20 different blog posts based on the different segments here. And so how can you take a content, your subject matter, and reuse it as efficiently as possible through all of your channels? And how can you then start personalizing all of that content for specific users? As well as obviously workflows and understanding kind of what your content creation workflow looks like. Because obviously, if you think about Drupal and workflows, that's in many ways is personalization, is based on who you are, what your user role is. You might have a different user experience on the back end administrating Drupal than maybe a super user would, right? So that's a form of personalization. Once you kind of have all of that in place and you have this really good content model in place, you can really start to decide the types of variables that you want to collect in order to start personalizing content. And so you can gather through web forms. You can start gathering personal user information. You can start gathering information like location. You can look at keywords and terms. You can look at the device type that they're coming from. For those of you who aren't familiar with Level 10's intelligence, they're doing a tremendous amount of this, and it's a plugin that goes into Drupal, and it's kind of that easy button for collecting a lot of this data on users. We can look at things like visitor frequency, because when you're creating, not really unlike creating kind of like a loyalty program, and I was listening to Hal Brierly speak, kind of just injecting this in, I apologize. You know, you can do a lot, and you can motivate someone very heavily through visitor frequency or through how much value they add to your business or organization. And if you start to take these things into consideration, you know, that's kind of the 101 of creating loyalty programs. If you guys aren't familiar with Hal Brierly, he created American Airlines rewards. If you guys are frequent flyers, that's his baby, his creation. He's kind of the godfather of creating loyalty programs. And more, even in the conversation I was having with him, he starts talking about trying to find out ways to personalize even further these loyalty programs for users, right? And it's looking at things like the devices that they're using and the frequency. Obviously, you can collect variables like date and time that might help you personalize your website. For example, say you're in the Middle East, you could potentially change the CSS and change certain types of information on your website to display something completely different at night, perhaps over there, versus in the daytime, you know. And you can have, when I log into the site, it knows that I'm in a certain time zone. Perhaps it changes the site in some way for my time zone. A lot of the variables in the data that you're collecting, you don't have to have an authentication in order to start collecting that data, right? And so there are really different ways to collect data. Oftentimes, it's implicit and explicit. And so implicit data is basically an implied information that you're getting from the user. The user didn't fill out a form or directly tell you that this is what their need is or this is who they are. It is implied, though, through things such as geolocation, or perhaps when a user comes to your website and they're looking at a very specific product. Well, you can imply from that they're interested in that product, or if someone's looking at a lot of marketing information on your website, then you can imply that person is most likely a marketer and not a very technical person, right? And so you can collect implicit data on users as well as explicit data on users. And CNN News is a good example, and a lot of news sources are really good about this, is when you authenticate, or even if you're not authenticated, they'll ask you straight up, who are you? What are you interested in? And they'll allow you to kind of personalize some of that information so that they can serve better content to you. And at the end of the day, you don't have to give them any personal information necessarily for them to gather this explicit data, because we want to be able to find content faster. We don't have to want to search around for things. There's just way too much noise in the world again. And so you can collect explicit data in Drupal, of course, through search, through contact information, you can create user surveys, web form, etc. And one of the biggest mistakes that I find when talking to organizations of any size is that they don't really have any key performance indicators. And so when you're looking at creating any type of campaign, you need to really start looking at the KPI and identifying some sort of performance indicator, because it could potentially be that perhaps in a situation like AT&T, had they not had key performance indicators, and if they really weren't watching how their personalization campaigns were impacting the company revenue, you could end up in a world of pain, because in their case, personalization was actually significantly hurting their business, because the personalization engine that was serving the advertising or the call to actions wasn't serving the right thing to the right users, And so they had to basically rip out the personalization engine and start from scratch on their project. But what are you going to measure for success? Are you measuring based on return visits, page views, CTAs or ad clicks, impressions? Are you looking at lead conversion, how many form fills there are, the number of purchases? And so create these certain KPIs and say, well, here's where we are now. Here's where we want to be. When we make this change, how is this going to impact our business? And look at those things, because making a small change could have a significant impact, positively or negatively. Oftentimes when you're creating these KPIs, you need to set up some sort of testing mechanisms. One of the things that we have data analysts on staff, and so we're always doing testing of landing pages and of call to actions on website. And there's a number of ways to do this, but two of the primary ways: A/B/N split testing. Basically what that is you have one control, and you set that control. You know that control is, maybe it's been on your site for a while, and then you introduce two variants that are completely different in some way, right? And so the idea is that when you create that variation, you go through, you test it, and if one does better than the other, and it consistently does better than the other, and the way that works is it's based on completely randomization at the end of the day. And so you'll show one ad to one user, you'll show your control, and you'll show your other ad to another user, and if one of the ads does better than the control, then at the end of the day that becomes your control, and then you start to tune it over and over again to get the best results that you can. Versus multivariate testing. Generally, multivariate testing is, instead of changing one variant, you're changing a lot of different things on the page. You're maybe changing out, instead of just changing out the titles, you're changing out title, content, placement on a page, a lot of different things. And so basically, this is probably a quicker way to make a quick impact on something. But at some point, you'll probably start with multivariate testing, and then as you're fine-tuning, you'll move over to more of an A/B split testing to really nail it down. So develop these testing procedures and understand that, so that when you release your personalization campaign, you can have a good understanding of these things. What's great about Drupal and the web in general is that there's a lot of ways to gather data from different systems now in real time, so that you can do real-time personalization. Obviously, for example, with websites, you can set cookies. With Drupal, obviously the same thing. But you can collect taxonomy information. You can, of course, collect data from WebForm, the WebForm module. You can collect data from commenting engines like Discuss. I don't know if you guys use that on your website, but they have their own analytics behind their system that they hold. You can actually integrate that analytics into Drupal, and so you can start, or Google Analytics for that matter. And so you can start kind of looking at how your content is being, how many times it's being commented on, to create kind of this analytics engine. You can look at things like, obviously, when a user registers, you're gathering personal information on the users. Within social media, there's data within AddThis. They have their own analytics. SumoMe has the same thing. Obviously, if you can, you're starting to see more people using OAuth on their websites. Either you're logging in through Facebook or logging in through Google. The reason for that is when you share that information, say, yeah, I'll log in that way, or I'll create a user account for that. They're grabbing all of that data, and they can then use that data to start personalizing content on their website, or personalizing offers to you, right? It makes perfect sense. Obviously, you can store data and gather data and pull data directly from Google Analytics, or if you're using Adobe Analytics, Kissmetrics, Moz Pro, whatever analytics systems you're doing, you can pull data from there. What I think Level 10 is doing is pretty savvy with intelligence. They collect data from kind of all of these sources with their system, and then they store all of that data in Google Analytics, and so they don't have to have this huge big data framework in the back. They can store all of that information in Google Analytics and then retrieve it and display it directly within Drupal's interface, which is really cool. But even taking it a step further, pulling data from Marketo or your automated marketing systems, as well as your CRM, and this is, I think, where you start to get real savvy, is when you can start taking all of this data and either keeping it in some kind of central repository, or moving a lot of that information directly into your CRM system, so that you can then pull that data and make real-time decisions about users based on information that you already have in your CRM system, which I think could be hugely important to a sales team. For example, perhaps you have a cookie set on a particular user and you know who that user is. and that user, that maybe that cookie is in turn associated with one of your users within Salesforce or your CRM, who is someone